Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
De manquer des repas, voyez-vous. Bonjour, don't all speak at once. Why don't we start?
Minister, just a few questions on the talks on the public inquiry. How many people have you asked, has the government asked to head the public inquiry, and what have they said?
Well, we're obviously not going to get into different justices with whom we've had conversations. I spoke again with my opposition counterparts this week already a couple of times, probably again later today. What's important for us is that we're making collaborative progress together. The four recognized political parties in the House of Commons have been working on this since June. We all hoped that this might have been concluded in a final way earlier, but the good news is we're continuing to do the work necessary and optimistic about getting to the right place. It's not easy to get four recognized political parties that, if you listen to the tone in the House of Commons in June, might have had different views on how this work should be done. The good news is we have arrived at very, I think, similar, thoughtful positions. So we're just going to continue that work, but we're not going to speculate on individuals.
There are behind the scenes saying that the reason why it hasn't moved along is because you can't find a judge or somebody else to lead it. So
yeah, but I'm not going to.
If you can confirm, I'm not asking.
No, and I'm not going to confirm what some government official said anonymously. What I'm.
Correct, because.
Well, but if I say it's not, I know the joke. If I say it's not correct, then I haven't confirmed. I'm not going to get into the details of sensitive discussions. In some cases, with sitting judges.
My point, though, is that the government officials behind the scenes say it's not the opposition party's fault. It's not about these negotiations. It's about trying to find somebody to lead it. Publicly, you and the Prime Minister are saying that it's about these negotiations between the parties. So there's a conflict there.
No, I don't see that as a conflict. The negotiations between the parties are proceeding very well and collaboratively. So I'm not pessimistic about the negotiations between the parties. It has been a collaborative, constructive exercise that frankly has gone on all summer. So a number of us had taken a week or two of holidays here and there, and we're joining video meetings from hotel rooms with one's family. We've been doing that work collaboratively, and I'm optimistic that we should get quickly, I hope, to a public outcome. But it is a sensitive issue when the Government of Canada, with the full support of the recognized parties in the House of Commons, is talking to, in some cases, sitting judges. So you'll appreciate that a scrum in Charlottetown on a Tuesday morning doesn't feel like the right place to get into those details. But the good news is the right people are getting into those details, and I'm confident that, and I share your excitement to find out where this ends. I really do. Believe me, I do. No, I was at my cottage in the summer. I had a nice time. The weather was nice, and I was having video meetings with Scheer, Terrien, and Julian. So you can see why I'm anxious to get this completed. Je suis d'accord, je vais le donner. Moi, l'échéancier que j'ai partagé, évidemment, par erreur avec vous autres, au mois de juin, c'est avant la fin des travaux parlementaires, ça va se finir, je ne suis pas inquiet. Hélas, on arrive à la fin du mois d'août, on est à Charlottetown, on n'a pas encore fini. On a fait énormément de progrès et on est très proche. Alors, les questions compliquées de structure, d'encadrement, sont pour tout fin pratique décidées unanimement. Alors ça, c'est positif. On arrive aux dernières étapes. Moi, j'aurais aimé que ça finisse au mois de juin. Là, j'aurais aimé que ça soit terminé au mois de juillet. Là, on est la dernière semaine, avant la dernière semaine du mois d'août. Moi, je pense qu'on est proche, mais c'est un travail sensible et difficile. Et vous pouvez imaginer le genre de personnes à qui le gouvernement parle, c'est les fonctionnaires du conseil privé qui font ces contacts-là. Mais évidemment, après qu'on a un consensus total, ça peut prendre du temps. Il y a des gens qui disent, je vais réfléchir sur ceci, expliquez-moi ça. Mais moi, j'espère que on arrive à la fin.
Minister Fraser and Minister Miller have both floated the idea of a cap on international students. Is that something that you would support around the cabinet table? And have you spoken to the provinces about this possibility that there could be fewer coming in the years to come?
No, I have not. I haven't seen the comments of my colleagues. The premiers haven't raised a cap on foreign students with me. I talk to the premiers a lot about housing for students for sure, but a broader range of housing affordability, access to housing in different housing markets. Premier Ford and I spoke about that as recently, I think, as last week. But nobody's talked to me about a cap, and I haven't seen those comments from my colleagues. But the premiers do talk to me also all the time about bringing in more immigrants. Foreign students are a different category, I understand that, but they want to bring in more immigrants. There are challenges around labor force. That's a constant discussion as well. So what's interesting for us is the discussion around bringing in the right people and more people to deal with some of the labor force challenges also, of course, brings questions around housing accessibility, housing supply. And the premiers are talking about those two things together with me. So that's constructive, and we think we can do both in the best way that will help Canadians.
The premiers have also been talking with you, I believe, about disaster financial assistance and needing to improve that program, that it's not working, and particularly the premier in this province is looking for help to pay for the repairs to the electrical grid. Is there any chance that the federal government is going to change that program so things like utilities can actually access it?
So again, my colleague Harjit Sajjan is probably the best person to talk to you. I understand he, of course, is in British Columbia because of the forest fire circumstance there. So the latest details of his discussions with provincial ministers I can't speak to. I've certainly spoken to Premier King. I'm hoping to see him tomorrow before I head back to New Brunswick. He's raised that issue. We have accelerated in a very significant way the idea of advance payments. Trying to, if you can estimate that the total cost of a disaster is going to be a certain amount of money, why not make an advance payment, particularly for smaller provinces like Prince Edward Island or Atlantic Canada, or particularly the territories. Imagine some of the challenges. So we're very sensitive to getting money to them quickly. Reviewing what is covered and what isn't covered in a decades-long agreement between 13 different jurisdictions, you don't change that on the fly. Unilaterally, you talk to your partners about what's working and what's not working and how we can make adjustments. So we're open to those conversations, but we accept that citizens in these provinces and territories expect the governments to move as quickly as possible and to be there in a reassuring way. That's what we're trying to do. But if people have premiers or ministers, provincial ministers or territorial ministers have suggestions of how we can do that better, we're all ears.
Do you see a future where the RCMP is out of contract policing?
Nobody's made decisions that significant or that important yet. The Prime Minister, my predecessor, and premiers and provincial public security ministers have talked about some of the challenges in contract policing. The RCMP have served as the contract police in jurisdictions, 8 out of 10 provinces, hundreds of different municipalities for decades. These are long-term contracts that go for almost another decade, and properly so. So offering up a comment on a local radio station, if you're a public safety minister about or a local mayor about the contract, that doesn't constitute a constructive discussion about how to improve it. And these are multi-billion-dollar agreements that exist for decades. But we take note and accept some of the concerns. I hear it from mayors. When I was the infrastructure minister, they would often talk about that. I could then I refer them to the public safety minister, so I've lost that opportunity now. But I'm still the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister. Premiers talk about that. We think there are some things that are working very well, some things that perhaps need to be improved, and some jurisdictions may decide to go in a different direction. And they're also entitled within their own jurisdiction to make those decisions. And we'll be constructive and collaborative in those conversations. But it's not even preliminary to say that there are plans to unscramble that omelet that quickly. But we're doing our own internal review. I've talked to RCMP officials. I'm going, I think, with the Commissioner to Regina in a couple of weeks. He and I are going to be talking about that again. But this will be an ongoing conversation over the next number of months.
Avez-vous de la difficulté à trouver un commissaire pour l'enquête? Est-ce que vous avez de la difficulté à trouver un commissaire pour l'enquête? Est-ce que c'est ça qui accroche?
Écoutez, comme j'ai dit en anglais, les discussions avec les partis d'opposition sont très constructives et avancent bien. Nous avons travaillé depuis déjà au-delà de 2 mois ensemble. Moi, je n'ai pas pensé que je passerais plusieurs jours par semaine de vacances au mois d'août à parler avec Alain Terrien, Peter Julian et Andrew Scheer. Bonne nouvelle, c'est qu'on l'a fait en amitié et avec un esprit collaboratif qui, franchement, je suis convaincu, va porter fruit. Moi, je suis très optimiste. C'est compliqué. Les fonctionnaires du conseil privé, comme il se doit, sont les responsables quand on arrive à un point de discuter avec un juge en poste. Discuter avec un juge à la retraite, c'est un peu moins sensible, mais parler avec un juge en poste, on l'a vu ça avec le juge Paul Rouleau, il faut passer à travers, par exemple, son juge en chef. C'est un protocole qui existe depuis les années de M. Harper. Alors, c'est pas moi qui prends le téléphone puis que j'appelle un juge sur une liste puis je dis « Hey, qu'est-ce que tu fais pour les 18 prochains mois, là? » C'est pas comme ça que ça fonctionne. Il faut être respectueux. L'indépendance de la magistrature demande qu'on soit prudent et qu'on procède selon un protocole qui a été examiné avec les juges en chef. Moi, j'ai eu à date 2 conversations extrêmement utiles avec le juge en chef Wagner de la Cour suprême pour lui demander ses conseils, demander au juge en chef Wagner s'il lui avait des suggestions de la bonne façon de procéder. Les fonctionnaires du conseil privé ont parlé aussi récemment que la semaine passée avec le juge en chef Wagner. J'ai trouvé ses conseils à moi aussi loin que le mois de juin très utiles. Moi, je suis très content qu'il a pris le temps de nous donner des suggestions et on va continuer de faire ce qui est nécessaire pour arriver au bon moment. Mais d'aller d'une façon hâtive, prémature, ne va pas amener le résultat qu'on cherche ensemble. C'est une discussion appropriée, encadrée, qui va rassurer les Canadiens et que toutes les formations politiques à la Chambre des communes vont partager comme le bon processus pour y arriver. Alors, la bonne nouvelle, c'est qu'on est très proche et je partage votre excitement, c'est sûr.
On the opposition leaders on the documents that David Johnston reviewed, why aren't the opposition leaders getting the initial primary documents that he reviewed? Why are they only getting summaries? That was a key defense that your government used in the spring to say, you know, you can have at it, you can look at it and see if you judge any differently, and now they can't.
I wouldn't necessarily share how categorical you were there. Our offer suggested by Mr. Johnston in the spring was to show them, excuse me, the confidential or top secret annex. To then go behind and look at all of the documents that Mr. Johnston and his experts in their review used to come up with the top secret annex is a different decision. As you know, the decision of who sees, in some cases, these top secret pentagram documents is not made by elected ministers. It's made by security officials with the support of the Privy Council office. Ms. May, and I've spoken to her over the summer about this, wanted to go and see the top secret annex. I was glad that she took the train trip from British Columbia to Ottawa. She made a considerable effort to do that. We appreciate that. And we've taken note of her concerns, and I will obviously raise it with the security officials and the Privy Council office, those who have, by law, the responsibility to decide who gets access to these documents. But we've heard her concern, and I will talk to the appropriate security officials to figure out the best way forward.
Thank you.
Can I ask you one last thing about housing? I'm sorry. There has been some chatter about.
I'm hungry. Like
I know. I'm almost done. I promise.
look at me, there's muffins,
I got a file,
croissants. I know. Like this is good here.
There has been some suggestion that we're taking in too many immigrants, and that's putting pressure on the housing sector, especially at the lower ranks. Right, the affordable housing part of the equation is really stretched. Is there any consideration around the cabinet table to restricting the number of immigrants that we accept each year?
Not that I'm aware of. I've had a conversation with Mark Miller about this yesterday. I don't think that's the best way. That's not the best way to deal with what is a real challenge. Premier Houston of Nova Scotia talks to me about trying to bring in entire construction crews from other countries to build the houses and then move into them. So everybody's trying to find the right way to deal with access to labor force. Huge challenge in every part of the country. And essential for the economic prosperity and growth of the country. But we're not insensitive to the housing challenges that existed before provinces asked us to bring in more immigrants to help with the labor force. So you have to be coherent, you have to be coherent a little bit here. But we totally accept that the conversation needs to proceed at the same time so that we don't inadvertently end up in a position that makes the housing affordability issue worse. We're all trying with provinces and territories to make it better. So we're quite positive that we can continue to do that.
As usual, I will begin by moving this. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Minister. I just have some questions about the countervailing duties.
Sure.
What impact are the new U.S. countervailing duties imposed on Canadian softwood lumber exports, and what are you going to do about it?
Well, let me say first to the Canadian softwood industry that they can expect and continue to count on their government standing on their side. These duties are unjustified and unwarranted, and they're illegal because they go against CUSMA. The industry knows that that's my perspective. That's the perspective of our government. I've raised this issue at every opportunity when I meet with my counterpart in the United States, and in fact, so have my colleagues, including, by the way, the Prime Minister to the President. We're going to continue to stand up for the Canadian softwood industry. I issued a statement yesterday of our intent to file a judicial review. I'll have more to say about that in the next number of days. But we are at CUSMA panels, and I would say that I've urged the United States to come in line with CUSMA on this, but we will continue to defend these unwarranted tariffs.
Why are you doing this now? I mean, the softwood lumber duties and this argument with the U.S. has been ongoing now for, I think it's 6 years. Why this move now?
We continue to explore new ways. We have to continue to explore new ways because the industry expects me and expects my government to. So do their workers, and we're going to continue to do this. And but what I would also say to the United States, which I have been, it would be much more preferable that we get to the negotiating table and let's come together and let's have a deal. But in the meantime, we're going to use all the tools at our disposal to stand up for the industry.
I guess a better question might have been, why not before? Why did we wait till now to do this?
We have been taking action. We have been at panels. We are, putting panels together, and this is just another tool.
Nova Scotia and Maritime provinces have argued for decades, often successfully, that forest products are not subsidized and are exempt from punitive U.S. countervailing duties. So specifically, what are you doing about maritime lumber?
Well, I've been working very closely with the industry here in the Maritimes in particular, and that argument, by the way, is exactly the argument that we have in fact successfully defended in forums like the WTO, and in fact in previous panels. I mean, it has ruled exactly that conclusion to Canada, which is why it's so important that Canada continues to defend our interests against these tariffs, and because they are unjustified. And they are, in our view, against our trade agreement.
You've spoken before about the government's response or the foreign agent registry. You've spoken, I think you've cautioned around it. Just wondering if there's any update, any progress on what's happening, and if we'll see a bill this fall.
Well, my colleague, Minister of Public Safety, is working very hard and has been. And what I've said in the past and continue to is let's make sure that we are talking to communities across the country, because I believe we can have a strong registry, but one that also considers any unintended consequences for communities across the country. So our government is going to do this work, and I know my colleague, the Public Safety Minister, is very much on top of this.
Bonjour chers amis. Nous avons eu, c'est maintenant le deuxième jour d'une retraite de cabinet très constructif. On est vraiment focusé sur l'économie et la classe moyenne. On a juste discuté le logement et hier, on a commencé notre retraite avec une discussion, avec une présentation de la ministre des Finances, du contexte fiscal et le contexte économique. We have been having some really constructive conversations here at our cabinet retreat. Our focus really has been and will continue to be the economy, and how the Canadian economy can deliver for the Canadian middle class. We've had a particular focus on housing and just had a really constructive discussion with some housing experts from across the country, sharing some great ideas. We kicked off the retreat last night with a presentation that the Prime Minister asked me to give on the fiscal and economic context and the fiscal responsibility that needs to underline all of our work to deliver for Canadians. Et maintenant, Anita, peut-être tu veux ajouter quelque chose?
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici comme présidente de la Conseil du Trésor. We had a very important discussion last night about fiscal management and prudence in government expenditures. And of course, recently, I asked all of my ministerial colleagues to ensure that they were examining their respective portfolios so that we can deliver a budget commitment of this year's budget for $15 billion over 5 years in refocused spending. And that's how I would like us to understand the request to my colleagues and their respective ministries, that we are really refocusing our spending from pandemic-type spending to the broader economic priorities of our country, la santé, les avantages dentales, the Canada Child Benefit, and $10 a day childcare. And so in order to deliver for Canadians on these very large priorities, we need to make sure that our fiscal house is prudently managed. And that's what I'll be bringing to the portfolio. That was the reason I wrote the letter to my colleagues. And of course, they're very receptive to ensuring that we are managing the government's finances, which is ultimately taxpayer dollars, prudently, efficiently, and effectively. Merci beaucoup. Et Randy?
Merci Anita, merci Chrystia, bonjour tout le monde. Je veux juste commencer en disant que nous sommes ici pour adresser les défis qui font face à la classe moyenne ici au Canada et le fait qu'on est vraiment à côté des Canadiens et Canadiennes en ce qui concerne les préoccupations de logement, les préoccupations avec le coût de la vie. Et c'est pourquoi nous sommes ici réunis. And as Liberals, we understand that fiscal responsibility is the foundation of everything that we're able to do and that we want to do. And if we talk about growing an economy that works for all Canadians, investing in a green economy, making sure that we have, for example, in my own backyard, the world's first net zero cement plant, Heidelberg Materials, it's because we were able to make those investments because we have a fiscal frame that hangs together and works together. And when it comes to the labor force and making sure that the growth that we want to see and continue to have in the country is about making sure that people have access to the skills they need and want so they can get that first and best job that they hope to have. And those are the kind of conversations we're having here today and tomorrow. And we look very much forward to a bright future as we get through some current economic challenges, but we know that brighter days are ahead. So we look forward to your questions.
Do you think that the national housing strategy needs to be revisited, or that it needs to be reworked for the problems that now exist today? I mean, it's only 6 years old, but there is talk that a new one is coming.
Our government has been focused on housing since actually the first election I ran in, since my by-election in 2013. It was a major focus of our campaign in 2015, and it has been a focus every year since then. In the most recent budget, we included some important additional investments in Indigenous, urban, northern housing. And, we really understand that this is a core challenge for Canadians. We've done some important things. I would maybe emphasize here the First Home Savings Account, which came online in April. And the financial institutions have been positively surprised by the number of Canadians who have opened accounts, are using that to save for their first home. So there's a lot of stuff that we've done and stuff which is coming on stream. The Housing Accelerator is another really important program, which actually we discussed in this panel, and that is just starting to deliver for Canadian municipalities right now. So there's a lot in the pipeline, but we absolutely understand there is a lot more as a government, as a country, we need to do when it comes to housing. And look, the reality is we believe in a Canada which is growing. We believe in a Canadian economy which is growing, in Canadian people who are becoming more prosperous, in a Canadian population which is growing. And if that is the kind of Canada you believe in, we have to build more homes, and we have to build them faster. And that absolutely was the focus of the conversation we've just had now.
Est-ce que vous avez discuté d'une diminution des seuils d'immigration? Est-ce que vous avez discuté d'une diminution des seuils d'immigration comme solution à la crise du logement?
Je sais que notre collègue, le ministre Miller, a déjà parlé avec vous concernant l'immigration. Et on est tous d'accord avec ce que le ministre Miller a dit. On comprend l'importance de l'immigration pour notre pays. Tous les pays du monde, tous les pays de l'Ouest aujourd'hui faire face à une crise démographique. Le Canada est chanceux parce que nous sommes un pays qui est prête à accueillir les immigrants. C'est un avantage économique pour nous aujourd'hui et pour demain. Mais vous avez raison que c'est important d'assurer les Canadiens qui sont ici, surtout pour assurer la jeunesse canadienne et pour assurer les immigrants, les nouveaux Canadiens, qu'on aura assez de logements pour tout le monde. Alors, on a du travail à faire et on est tous d'accord avec le Premier ministre qui a souligné l'importance du logement en créant une grande discussion sur le logement avec des experts de tout notre pays pour trouver des solutions additionnelles qu'on pourra mettre en place.
On the spending review, you're talking about saving less than 0.1% of money that the government spends over 5 years. The Business Council of Canada calls that a rounding error. How do you convince Canadians that you're serious about this when it's such small numbers over 5 years that you're talking about? When the budget's 550 billion, you're saving 15 billion over 5 years. It doesn't seem like a very substantive exercise in cutting the federal government's costs.
So let me say a couple of things there. First of all, when it comes to the 15 billion in repurposed spending, this is not new news. This was a commitment we made in the budget in the spring, and that commitment underpins the entire fiscal forecast that the budget was based on. So this is something we said months ago that we would do. People have been working really, really hard on putting it in place. And my wonderful colleague, the president of the Treasury Board, has taken the next step to act on this, to deliver on what we promised. In terms of the broader question of government and fiscal responsibility, let me just say this. We are liberals. We believe government has an important role to play in supporting Canadians, in building a social welfare net that supports Canadians, and in putting in place programs that help our economy to grow. Just think about early learning and childcare. That happened because the federal government decided to make an investment in early learning and childcare. And we are seeing the results. We are seeing the results in the highest labor force participation rate for working age Canadian women in our history. And that is coming at a time when we have labor shortages, and it is helping families with affordability. So our approach is we need government, and government must do important things for Canadians, for the economy, for Canadian people, including, by the way, in housing. We also understand, I'm just going to finish, Anita. We also understand that government is able to deliver for Canadians when government operates on a responsible fiscal footing. And that, by the way, is a profoundly liberal conviction. It was Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin that did the very hard work of fighting to get the AAA rating that Canada currently enjoys. And what we are committed to is doing the things Canadians need us to do and maintaining that responsible fiscal foundation. And we are doing that. Canada, it has a AAA rating, notwithstanding the great investments we've made in Canadians. We have the lowest deficit in the G7, and we have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. We understand that if we want to continue to do big things for Canadians and build those things on that firm fiscal foundation, we have to be thoughtful about where the money is spent. And so that's why, the repurposing of spending of $15 billion, absolutely the right thing to do. And absolutely, that $15 billion is already in the fiscal forecast. The fiscal forecast and the budget that we tabled in the spring includes that $15 billion of savings so that we could fund the programs that were outlined in the budget. So it's not a new savings, it's something built into the fiscal track, and it is an approach which is very fiscally responsible and very in tune with generations of liberal and progressive leaders in Canada.
And just building on that, it's $15 billion over 5 years and then about $4 billion thereafter. And the exercise is extremely important. Spending reviews have been part of previous governments. But what we are asking departments across the government to do is to take a look at your expenditures and determine where there is the possibility to refocus that spending so that we can continue to deliver for Canadians in the large projects like childcare and dental care and health care and $10 a day childcare at that. The other part of the work of the Treasury Board that is relevant here is in cutting red tape. So getting your fiscal house in order involves not only examining unnecessary expenditures that can be refocused, but also where are there regulations that are making life less efficient, less effective for Canadian businesses and Canadian organizations. We have a bill before the House of Commons right now focusing on red tape reduction, and that very much is part of ensuring that our fiscal house is in order so that we can make the most effective use of taxpayer dollars.
Mr. Freeland, you answer the immigration question in English, please?
Je viens de parler des étudiants étrangers ici sur le campus de l'Université du Prince-Édouard qui sont inquiets du scénario qui a été évoqué ce matin, c'est-à-dire de mettre un plafond sur le nombre d'étudiants étrangers qui viendraient au Canada. Ils disent on devrait plutôt se concentrer sur la construction de logements plutôt que nous cibler, nous. Qu'est-ce que vous répondez à ces gens-là, à ces jeunes-là que j'ai rencontrés aujourd'hui?
Je vais commencer en disant que nous avons une excellente collègue une nouvelle ministre de l'immigration et je sais qu'il a ce matin répondu à cette question et on va appuyer le ministre Miller dans son très important travail. Concernant la générale question de l'immigration et du logement, nous sommes convaincus qu'on doit être un pays en croissance. C'est un avantage particulièrement canadien et on doit être fiers de cela. C'est un des avantages économiques qu'on a grâce à notre société canadienne qui est prête à accueillir des nouveaux Canadiens, qui ajoute beaucoup d'innovation, d'énergie à notre société. C'est une bonne chose. D'autre côté, les nouveaux Canadiens et les Canadiens qui sont ici déjà, ils ont besoin du logement. Et si nous voulons être un pays en croissance, et moi je suis absolument convaincue qu'on doit être un pays en croissance, on doit construire du logement. Et c'est vraiment un des thèmes principaux de notre discussion aujourd'hui et ce sera un des thèmes principaux du travail de notre gouvernement dans les mois prochains.
Ms. Freeland, you're going to hear from Paul Kershaw from the University of British Columbia. I don't want to ruin his presentation, but one of the things he's going to tell your cabinet is that one of the easiest things you can do is walk out of that meeting and say, we'd like to see house prices stall in Canada to signal Canadians you want to bring some affordability back to the market. Is that something you'd be willing to do?
I really believe that when it comes to housing, we need to understand that this is a central preoccupation of Canadians, and rightly so. We are a country which is growing, and I really believe that is a good thing. But if you want a Canada that is growing, you have to have more homes for a growing country. We have done some significant things. I talked about the first home savings account proving to be very popular with Canadians looking to buy their first home. I am very optimistic that the National Housing Accelerator Fund is going to make a real difference because it's kind of a race to the top for municipalities and encourages them to do what works for their city to get more homes built. So we absolutely recognize we need to get more homes built. Canadians are concerned, and rightly so. A couple of weeks ago, I did a roundtable in my constituency in Toronto and met with some constituents who had gotten in touch with my office just to talk about housing. And it was really useful to hear from them and to hear, I think there is particularly a generational equity concern, and we really need to be sure that young Canadians are able to afford a place to live. So that is for sure a concern, a preoccupation of ours. And for us, the solution is build more homes faster because that's what our growing country needs.
You can support dialing back immigration levels to help alleviate some of the housing supply issues that we're dealing with. Do you think there should be less arrivals every year to try to, make the situation a little better for folks that are already here?
So I know that you've spoken to our great colleague, Mark Miller, who has just taken over the immigration portfolio. He is looking at all the tools at his disposal in a very thoughtful and careful way. And, we collectively, we talked about the remarks he made to you earlier today. We know what he said because he says the same thing to us. So he's looking at it, and Mark has the support of the whole team as he looks at this. But I do really want to say, our focus, and it is the right thing for us to be focused on as a team, is housing, because that is a principal concern of Canadians today. And we need to be sure that, if you believe the premise that Canada needs to be a growing country, that a growing Canadian population is an economic advantage for us as a country, and I certainly do believe that. And when I look at other Western countries that are really struggling with being weighed down by a demographic crisis, I am so glad that Canada is probably the country in the world which is the most successful at welcoming and integrating immigrants. So that is a great thing. That is a national economic advantage. But at the same time, we need to recognize as a country, and we surely recognize as a government, that if you believe in a Canada which is growing, you had better build the homes that a growing country needs. And we absolutely recognize we have to build more homes faster. That's what we're committed to doing, and we've heard some great ideas on how to do it.
Madame Anand, est-ce que vous prenez l'engagement que les services directs aux Autochtones seront épargnés des compressions que vous demandez à vos collègues?
Merci pour la question, pas du tout. Nous n'allons pas couper les services comme ça pour les Autochtones. Nous n'allons pas couper l'appui pour les forces armées canadiennes, par exemple, pour les déploiements internationaux. Donc ça, ce n'est pas un exercice pour couper les services comme ça, mais pour les départements d'examiner leur budget et leur budget opérationnel. Et peut-être nous pouvons gérer un processus où on peut bouger les dépenses pour les choses, les priorités pour notre gouvernement et pour notre population, pour appuyer la population canadienne, comme l'économie verte, comme la santé mentale, comme les avantages dentaux. Ça, c'est l'exercice ici. Et comme ma collègue a dit déjà, ça, c'est une promesse dans notre budget 2023.
Écoutez,
No, you guys are so good. I'm just letting you roll. I mean, look, on immigration and housing and workforce development, they're all linked. And if we want to talk about real numbers, 100% of labor force growth in this country is going to come from newcomers. That's just the reality of our birth rates. That's the reality of our population growth. Donc en français, 100% de la croissance de notre main-d'œuvre ici au Canada va venir des nouveaux arrivants, de l'immigration.
Et un peu des maires.
Et un peu des maires aussi, parce qu'on a vu, grâce aux garderies. En ce même temps, ce qui est important, c'est que les gens qu'on amène ici construisent les maisons dont on a besoin. Like the people we're bringing here are actually helping us to build the homes that we need. And the national housing strategy, housing's a right. We passed that in the House of Commons. It's an international right. We've recognized it here. And the government of Canada is going to continue with our national housing strategy to get the work done. But we also need the private sector to do its part, because this is a partnership between the federal government, the provincial governments, and the private sector. And when it comes to workforce development, there's a lot of levers that we can pull on in partnership with provinces. But we're going to make sure that those levers are actually focused on this preoccupation, very important preoccupation of Canadians right now, which is how do they get their first and best home, and how do they have that kind of future that they want to see for themselves. And that's with us making sure that people have the skills and the jobs they need, that we have robust immigration, and that we have the private sector and the federal government working together to respond to housing needs. Merci.
Okay, merci beaucoup.
I think our message has been what we published last week as the National Housing Accord, that this system is in a crisis, that Canada needs to build 5.8 million homes, according to the CMHC. We estimate that 2 million of those will need to be purpose-built rental to address this crisis. But overall, that we've had housing supply crises in the past. We had one at the end of World War II. And we had one in the late 1960s when immigration went up, and the first wave of baby boomers were leaving their parents' homes and going into apartments. So we dealt with those crises back then, and a lot of the same policy instruments that the federal government used back then, they could use again today.
And I'd add that what our document accomplishes, or what it tries to do, set out a bit of a roadmap for the federal government on on how to address the rental housing crisis, how to address the issues in particular. I work in homelessness, so we're interested in making sure there's enough social housing in Canada to meet the needs of those people who won't be able to live in the market or afford market rental housing. But this is really a roadmap for the federal government. And I think another key point out of this is that it's not just about money. Mike has outlined 6 barriers to new rental housing construction. Money is one of them, but coordination is going to be key. So one of the messages I think we wanted to convey is the need for a national housing accord and an agreement between the levels of government, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, labor, and others to come up with a national strategy.
Do you feel that they were receptive to that? I mean, they haven't committed to any of your recommendations. They've called it a task list, but not committed to them yet. Did you feel that they were receptive to these?
I'll let Mike speak for himself, but my impression was this is an issue that the government is seized with. I think this is an issue all parties in Parliament are seized with, and I got a sense of impatience and a sense of urgency out of the government, whether or not they're willing to commit to anything at this point.
Yeah, I would say obviously we can't discuss what happened in the room, but I would say overall I don't think we would be here unless they were taking this issue seriously. But I think it will also be incumbent on activists and others in the group to keep holding the government accountable to hold sort of progress. So I view this as a first step in the process, but there's a lot more that needs to happen.
What's holding things back? I mean, what's the biggest thing that's holding things back right now?
There's a few things. So we outline 6 in the report. One is just a lack of coordination between the orders of government and industry. So we point that one out. Another one is a lack of skilled labor. That this has been known for a while, but we just don't have the electricians, the roofers, the plumbers, the sheet metal workers to build these homes. Another one is that homes are, particularly purpose-built rental, they're just not economically viable right now to construct in many cases. That particularly with higher interest rates, we've seen housing starts down about 10% year over year, despite the fact that rents are up significantly. So our accord calls on the government to do things like provide long-term financing for projects. It calls to remove the HST on purpose-built rental projects. Calls on reintroducing tax credits like the kind seen back in the 1960s to build apartments. We have a lack of productivity in the housing sector, so we call on a national innovation strategy to increase that productivity. We have the permissions system is an issue at all orders of government. Getting things through the municipal level, provincial level, where it be things like the OLT, or through the CMHC can often cause delays. And then finally, as has been pointed out by many, we've had a 30-year period where we just did not build social housing in this country. And because of that, that's one of the many things that got us here in the first place is that the federal government got out of building social housing in the early 1990s, and over time that need accumulated.
Yeah, I would just add that I think part of what has stalled a lot of progress here is that this is a really complex problem. It's a bit of a Gordian knot, really, when it comes to policy. And I think we were able to articulate a bit of a pathway, a bit of a way out. But before then, I think governments knew they needed to do something, but were really unsure of what to do, what their role is. You look at the complexity between the jurisdictions, and we were able, I think, to boil it down into a path forward, anyway, a place to start to begin undo that knot. And I think that's why, frankly, that's why we're here.
Can you know, obviously we've seen the question of international students really take the forefront, and Mike, you've spoken a lot about this in the public for a few months now. Is this kind of an easy out that people are pointing to now to blame something, or is this actually meaningful, and how do you quantify the impact?
It's meaningful. I'm going to give you a qualitative answer, unfortunately, but I look at my the subdivision I grew up in London, Ontario. I spent the first 11 years of my life in this neighborhood. It's about 6.5 kilometers from Fanshawe College. It's not even that close. When I grew up there, every house had young kids in it. Every house had families. Now that neighborhood is getting turned into a sea of student rentals. So what this rental crisis is causing is this bleeding into an ownership crisis. It's that the 2023 version of my parents in 1970 can't buy those homes because they're competing against investors who are well capitalized, who are turning these into student rentals. And none of that, and I should be very clear about this, none of that is to blame international students. It's not the responsibility of international students to ensure that there is enough housing in London, Ontario. This is a systemic failure, I would say, of both the federal and provincial governments, and as well the higher education sector in which I work, to ensure that there's enough housing for both domestic and international students. And domestic and international students are the biggest victims of this, not the cause of it.
We're talking about a lot of things that are 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 years in the future, but a lot of people are experiencing the risk of homelessness or housing affordability now. What can we do quickly to try and alleviate some of that pressure much more quickly than 2030?
Well, you know, one thing, so we know that Canadians are losing their housing today. Modern mass homelessness like we see it today, is bigger than our largest natural disasters. 263,000 people will lose their homes this year, right? So there is a real urgency, and you're exactly right. It is going to take time, even if tomorrow afternoon we got all of the tax measures and all that, it's going to take time. But everybody who's at risk of homelessness or who is in core housing need is in housing today. And we can keep them in that housing by supporting their income. So one of the things that we proposed in this paper is the creation of homelessness prevention and housing benefit that would apply to nearly 400,000 households and those at greatest risk. And by supporting their rent, we can keep them in their homes today. And that can be done really quickly because they already have the infrastructure in place through the one-time payment that was done previously. It's very similar to the CERB. It's very similar to the one-time payment. You use the tax system, that could be done in months. We could help those in greatest need, but there's other measures in the report that can have an impact quickly, if not right away. For example, removing the GST, 22% of projects that are on the books right now are not going forward just because of interest rates, right? We can remove HST, we can get some of these projects going so they already have a head start, but there's other measures like the Rapid Housing Initiative that over 12 or 18 months could start delivering housing, but immediately supporting income.
Have you been able to quantify how much that homelessness benefit would cost or how much it would need to be worth?
It would be approximately $3 billion a year, depending on how there's varying ways that you can structure it. You can offer different depths of subsidy, so it's between $1.5 to $3 billion. But it's about the same cost as the last measure in the budget supporting new home buyers. There was a savings account, so it's in the same magnitude as some of those measures.
What the government points to is their new first-time home buyers savings account. Do you view that as a program that is helping new people enter the market, or is this for people who already have money and finding other ways to save it and save on taxes as a result?
Well, I think that the purpose of that is to actually just help first-time home buyers compete against those investors who are, again, buying up neighborhoods like Tweedsmuir in London. I think the overall challenge, so I think that part of it makes sense. I think the overall challenge is that just sort of increases the amount of money in the sector. So you have even more money chasing the same number of homes, which leads to price escalation. So I think to deal with it, you have to deal with the core. You need more housing supply, and you need to deal with the core issues that are causing first-time home buyers not to be able to win these bids. This is kind of, in a sense, almost sort of papering over some of the issues. I'm sure it's helping some people, but it's not a viable long-term solution, in my view.
Can I just circle back to the international students question? The ministers have floated a cap. The Minister of Housing and Immigration have both suggested maybe that there needs to be a cap on how many students are admitted each year. Do you think that that's one possible fix that could alleviate some of the housing crunch?
Yeah, I don't know entirely what that would look like, and I think ideally this should be done in conjunction with the provinces, right? Because there's obvious concerns that if that gets scaled down, then that's going to put particularly colleges in Ontario, where you're seeing most of the international student growth, that's going to put them in a precarious financial position. But again, there are things that the federal government could do unilaterally that even wouldn't necessarily be a cap. So for instance, in order to get an international student visa, students have to show that they have so much in savings, so much in income, that kind of thing. There already is a set of criteria to approve those visas. If the federal government chose to, it could increase, it could strengthen those criteria, which would make fewer international students eligible, and then the ones that were eligible, because you've increased those financing criteria, they're more likely to be able to afford homes. And you could also, one of the other things you could do is link those student visas to having on-campus housing. So you could create a separate stream going, okay, if you have access to on-campus housing, you have this second stream to get a student visa. And what that would do is create incentives for the colleges and universities to create on-campus housing.
What is your gut feeling that your recommendations will become Liberal policy?
My hope is actually that they become policy of all federal parties. I'm hoping we have a race to the top on this issue. I know you guys are laughing at me like I'm a little bit naive here, but I run off of optimism and caffeine. And overall, that I'm cautiously optimistic. I think what we're seeing in the polling data, David Coletto at Abacus and others have some great polling data on this, showing how important housing issues are to across the board, but particularly with folks under 45. So I really think there is an appetite out there for all the parties, and we're hoping that not just the government, but all of our opposition parties start to adopt these in their platforms as well and advocate for them. Because we would like to take the partisanship out of this. If we can get cross-party agreement on some of these ideas, it's going to make it far easier to get them through Parliament.
Are you able to quantify the crisis in a way that's understandable for the person who bought their house in sort of Midtown, Toronto, or somewhere else, in the 1980s and doesn't understand why avocado toast savings aren't cutting it now?
I think we saw this, so I'm from Calgary, and we saw this in, 2000 and 2006, 2007, and everybody knows somebody who's struggling with rent, who's struggling with their payments somehow. They have a son or a daughter in university that they're struggling to find a place to go. They want to move. Their parents are trying to find a place to live. I think you would find that everybody knows somebody, and recent polling data that I've seen suggests that a quarter of Canadians don't know how they're going to pay rent next month, right? That to me is a clear and present danger, and that this is in the everyday experience of the vast majority of Canadians.
On the, talking about the benefit, $3 billion a year, did you guys pick up the sense from them in there that they are willing to put more money into this? Because they're coming out, they're talking about, they're going to cost redirecting mode or savings, fiscal prudence mode. Do you guys think they're advocates of financing?
Well, so again, I can't sort of focus on what was said in their cabinet confidences and all that, but one of the things that we tried to do when we wrote the National Housing Accord is be cognizant of those fiscal realities. That we believe that there are a lot of things that the federal government can do that would be relatively inexpensive, like removing the GST, HST, like fast-tracking approvals through the CMHC. One of the things that we're advocating for is the CMHC to have a catalog of pre-approved housing designs, just like they did in the 1940s and 1950s. What that would do is it would lower the cost of all the architectural costs and other things that go around housing, but it would also speed up the approvals process to deal with that timeline issues. So by design, what we tried to do was operate under a fiscal reality because yeah, we recognize that. We recognize that, we've seen the Treasury Board minister have that mandate that she needs to reduce government spending by 15 billion.
Well, I would add that, generally speaking, they can see Mike and I coming a mile away. And they know what we're going to be after. And the housing crisis in Canada is so acute. Like 2 million units is over $1 trillion of investment. Now, there's no government that's going to have $1 trillion to put into this. So part of the conversation is about how do you channel private capital into the market to generate more market purpose-built rental, but then focus the role of government on those people who will never be able to afford to live in market rental housing. And we have proposed ideas that I think are in the public domain about, the federal government owning land, owning housing in a way that it doesn't add to the net debt. Like we think about infrastructure. I think we really need to rethink our relationship with housing and fundamentally, especially non-market housing, it's vital national infrastructure in the same way the St. Lawrence Seaway is, or TMX, or military bases, or roads, or other things like that. It's vital, and there's a role in for the federal government to own that land, that housing, and lease it to nonprofit sector, municipal governments, in a way that they continue to hold an asset, and so it doesn't become part of the net debt. So there's ways to leverage the federal balance sheet in a way that doesn't break the bank.
This is not a new problem, right? This has been building for quite a while. There's an acute crisis, like you just said. So what do you think it is about this summer that has caused this to blow up as a political issue? The whole cabinet, this seems to be the big topic of the cabinet retreat. Is it just the interest rate hikes over the past year? What else? Why is this blown up as an issue really this summer?
Yeah, it's funny because I used to write about this on Twitter in 2019, and none of you wanted to talk to me back then. Now I've got the last laugh, unfortunately. I think a part of it is that interest rate hike. That for a while, like if we look last summer, for instance, rents were going up 20% year over year on new leases in a lot of college and university towns in Canada. And that's a massive thing, but it only affects a smaller slice of the population. But now you've got those rent increases, you've got, with the higher interest rates, all of those mortgages rolling over, that now it's affecting a larger and larger segment of the population. So this is absolutely affecting minds. I do think some of the public polling data that's come out is sort of helping focus on this, because again, I don't think it was fully well understood, the public sentiment on this. And I think in general, at all orders of government, I think this issue had always been viewed as somewhat zero sum, right? That you had on one side homeowners and the other side people who'd like to be homeowners, and if you helped one, that would harm the other, and that caused political tensions. But I think there's an increasing realization that a lot of existing homeowners are not happy with the status quo. They're not happy with the status quo because their mortgages are renewing at much higher interest rates. Or they're not happy with the status quo because they have an 18-year-old that's about to start college and university, can't find somewhere to live. Or they have a 28-year-old that's living in their basement that they can't get rid of. Or they've got a 38-year-old who had to move a couple hours away to find housing, and now grandma and grandpa never get to see the grandkids anymore. So I think there's an understanding that this issue is a little bit less zero-sum than I think we thought it was in the past.
And I think from the perspective of those in sort of the lower end of the income spectrum and people experiencing homelessness, this has been building since the pandemic, right? And you take the pandemic. So we have a housing crisis that's been building for 40 years. You have a pandemic that is forcing more people into the streets. We saw an increase in homelessness as a result of the pandemic. You see cost of living crisis now, where rent has gone up 12%, 15%, 30% in some places, plus the price of food, and low-income households have no ability to absorb that, pushing more people on the street. And their experience now is seeing more encampments, more people on transit. They're feeling this pinch from their own sort of cost of living increase, and that I think is pushing us to a place where we are today.
This is that reverse, but can you just both say your names and titles so we have the right ones for this particular situation?
No. Tim Richter, President of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness.
And my name's Mike Moffatt. That's Moffatt, 2 T's. Scottish names are hard to spell. And I am the founding director of the Place Center, and Place is in all caps, kind of like the Ottawa Red Blacks. Well, I just have to make sure I get the spelling right. So Mike Moffatt, founding director of the Place Center.
All right, thank you, guys.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.